And welcome. I'm Susan Shapiro, and I'm thrilled to be here at the California Inclusion Collaborative Conference. And this session is called The Goal of UDL is Expert Learning for All, each and every single student. I'm going to talk with you a little bit about the history of inclusive education, about the framework of universal design for learning, and about this concept of expert learning. I did a training one time. In fact, I've been talking with a leadership series for about 25 years of parents and families and caregivers and self-advocates who get information about best practices and evidence-based strategies in the field of disability, really. And I do part of the education session. And I was talking this year at that series about UDL as part of my session, Universal Design for Learning. And after the session, one of the parents who worked as an advocate in the state came up to me and said, "Do you know this is transformational?" And she said, this is something that I'm going to add to my list of things I asked for in an IEP meeting. For decades, I was asking for supports and services and working really hard to get those. Then I was asking for full inclusion, access to that general education curriculum. And now I'm going to ask for expert learning. And I want my schools, for students to design using UDL so that the students can become expert learners. We're going to explore a little bit about what she means by that. And we'll do that in this next hour. So the goal of this session is really to make clear the relationship between learning design and expert learning skills. And then to offer us just a reminder that each and every learner has the right to become and can be an expert learner. If you just want to take a moment and think for a second, we know that our nervous systems are goal-directed. About a goal that you bring to this session, you might want to add it to the chat box and help somebody else focus on something related to this topic, or maybe just think quietly, but you can pause and take a moment to do that. This is the UDL. These are the UDL guidelines, and I imagine many of you have seen these, and maybe some of you have not. This session is not going to introduce you to the UDL guidelines. It's not an intro to UDL, although there are resources out there on the CAST webpage that you can find to learn a little bit about UDL. But we're going to talk about the framework and specifically about the goal of the framework. And the goal of UDL is expert learning. I've circled in yellow at the bottom of this, this chart the words expert learners. And expert learners are learners who are purposeful and motivated, resourceful and knowledgeable, strategic and goal-directed. We're going to talk about how UDL sets a learning environment up so that learners can have both access and agency. At CAST, we've defined expert learning with these terms, and we're going to be iterating on the UDL guidelines at CAST and thinking also about what it really means to be an expert learner. So this may not be a complete list of expert learner characteristics, but for right now, we're going to use this as a definition of expert learning. I'll put into the sketch, you'll see a link to a PDF document of both of these charts and some additional resources as well. So if you have difficulty reading them on the slides. But expert learners, they know how to make learning plans. They know how to abandon strategies that don't work. They know how to pick resources. They know how to self-regulate during learning. They know how to be goal-directed. They know how to employ executive functions. They know how to learn. And sometimes I think we get caught up in teaching content when we know that learners are going to have many jobs throughout their lives. They're going to learn to do things that do not yet exist, learn to use technologies that have not been created. And learning to learn and being a really good learner is a really important outcome of school. You'll notice that the colors on the guidelines and the colors of these expert learner characteristics are the same-ish. The green's a little off. And it's by no coincidence. If you want the green stuff in learners, if you want learners who are goal-directed, you have to kind of do the green stuff in design. And again, this session is not going to step you through how to do that, but just to alert you to the fact that that relationship exists. So there are going to be three things that I do during this hour. The first is to define expert learning. The second is to just introduce you to what we call the UDL Core Concepts, and there are three. I'll take you through those very quickly, and we'll think a little bit about how those make sense, or the relationship between those core concepts and the ways we've been thinking about learners with disabilities over time. And then that will kind of be a segue into a little bit of my own story in special education, and not because I think my story is particularly interesting, but I think my story parallels some of the questions we've been asking in the field about learners with disabilities and learning designs. And I think our questions have always been well-intended, and our questions have always been the edge of what we understand and know. But I think sometimes our questions have been short-sighted. And today I think we're asking a question that touches the edge of what we know how to do in design, that's a little bit further away from where we started. If you remember, we started in 1975 at letting students with disabilities have the right to education. So we have come a long way, but we have a long way to go, I think. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about expert learning by telling you about one of my daughters. I have 4 daughters, and the youngest is Harriet. I'm a single mom, and I work a lot. And so when Harriet's Spanish teacher called me and said that I needed to come in for a meeting, and Harriet wasn't doing very well at school, I was surprised. I didn't do a lot to support Harriet's executive function with school. She did well as a student. She seemed to be organized. She's the youngest child. I figured she was fine, right? And we went into the meeting, and her Spanish teacher said she has a C- in this class, which was not the grade that Harriet typically would have in a class. And I looked at Harriet, and she kind of looked at me, and the teacher said, she's just not doing the homework. And I'm going to tell you this story because in this story, what Harriet does is really embody expert learning. She's an expert learner in this moment, in this Spanish class, and that doesn't mean that Harriet's an expert learner in every moment of her learning, or that Harriet does dinner dishes at night. But Harriet is an expert learner in this story, and you'll notice as I tell you what happens, that she's not a good student. That's what I would have been. I would have done everything the teacher said, gotten the grade. Harriet was an expert learner. So I look at Harriet and I sort of say, why did you not do the homework? And she says, well, Mom, the homework is the same thing every night. We have to go onto this digital, this website, and there's this digital worksheet that we do. It's every single night the same thing, and I just can't learn that way. And you know I want to be an attorney, and you know I want to work on social justice, and you know that I have to have 2 languages in order to do that, and I don't know if that's true, but that was her 9th grade belief. And so I really want to learn the Spanish. I don't just want to get a good grade in this class. I really want to learn the Spanish. In this story, Harriet is an expert learner. Oh, let me go back and tell you. So she says, so I can't learn that way. I found this website that has these videos. And so I get these note cards, and we had been stopping at the dollar store quite often to get note cards. She said, I have these note cards, and I made this system for me to study all the Spanish verbs and all the Spanish content by watching these videos and using these note cards. And her teacher chimes in and says, she does really well in the exams. She has over 90 in every single exam. She is learning the content. So those of you who are thinking, competency-based education, yes, 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 yes. But in this moment, I want to highlight the expert learning part of that. Harriet knew herself as a learner. She was purposeful and motivated, goal-directed. She wants to be an attorney. She believes she needs to learn Spanish in order to do the work she wants to do in her career. Resourceful and knowledgeable, she found a way to learn that information. Strategic and goal-directed, right? She created a system using note cards and videos for how to accomplish her goals. Expert learners make choices. They think about how they want to engage. Expert learners think about which representation of the content is going to be the most accessible cognitively for them. And they think about how they want to interact with materials, with ideas, and with each other. When we know this about expert learning, we can think about the implications for design. If I know that expert learners that they make choices around how they want to engage, how they want to make meaning, how they want to interact with learning, I've got to make sure that I design options for them to make those choices. And expert learners reflect on learning, not just how am I doing with math or how am I doing as a reader, but how am I doing as a learner? What have I learned most recently about learning? What do I want to learn next? What do I already do really well as a learner? Harry said upon reflection, this made me realize that I need to get better at time management. I mean, I still learn the Spanish, but I didn't save enough time to do the other work. I also need to get more sleep. And I think that it's always been true that wellness is a consideration for an expert learner. And perhaps during this pandemic, it's become even more so, right? As learners are more often learning at home without the support of the classroom environment and teachers, that conversation in their own minds about wellness is probably a little bit more important. So if you'd like to, just pause for a moment and think about how you might explain this concept of expert learning to someone who's not here today. What's the difference between expert learning and being a good student? I would have said, I'm not going to learn Spanish, but I'm going to get an A in this class. I'll do the homework, even if I don't really understand the content. What is expert learning? So just take a moment. You might want to put something in the chat box so our learning is public here in this session, or maybe you just want to think quietly. I know I'm an introvert, and so sometimes I like to just process things in my own mind. I'm going to jump now into thinking a little bit about the UDL Core Concepts because they really are the philosophical framework behind those UDL guidelines. So you can learn about the UDL guidelines and how they're organized and aligned to the brain networks and the field of neuroscience. But I want you to understand the principles and the philosophical really stakes in the ground of universal design for learning as we think about this history we have with special education and learning design and this journey toward expert learning for all learners. There are 3 UDL core concepts, and I will go through them, and then we will jump into looking at those questions around learning design and learners with disabilities. So they come from 3 places. The first core concept comes from the field of architecture, the second from the field of neuroscience, and the third is about learning. First core concept is that the barrier is in the environment, not the learner. And I think many of us in special education, we're kind of, that's our starting point, right? And we're always trying to change something so that this learner can be successful. We've never seen the learner as broken, right? We've seen the environment as full of barriers. So that's the first UDL core concept, and it comes from the field of architecture, right? The barrier is not the person who uses a wheelchair. The barrier is the fact that the building only has one way to get in, right? There's just this tall set of stairs, right? That's the barrier, not the fact that I need to use a wheelchair to enter the building. You may have seen this image before. I just want to talk through it a little bit because I think it's a quick way to think about this core concept of the barrier living in the environment. On the left, you see an image that is perhaps a representation of equality, everybody getting a box, everybody getting a little bit of a lift and getting the same thing. That middle image is where you see some people standing on a box and some standing on a bigger box, is about equity, people getting what they need, right? But the third box on the right-hand side is an image where the fence is now a chain link fence, right? And so in that third image, the question is asked, yes, we might want to provide some boxes. Yes, we might want to make boxes available to people who want them. But is there some way we can remove this barrier? And sometimes the answer is yes, we can just take a fence down, metaphorically speaking. And sometimes the answer is no, but we can change the fence in some way. We can reduce the barrier. So in this image, it's a chain link fence now, which poses less of a barrier for seeing through. I also want to say that in Universal Design for Learning, we provide supports and options in those learning environments so that learners can say, hey, I need a chair, right? Or hey, I need a box. Or I don't normally need a box, but today I do, because we know that learners vary in the ways that they learn. The second core concept in UDL is that variability is the norm. So I'm not a neuroscientist or a learning scientist, but what I do know from what I've learned from people who are doing that research is that human brains vary in how they make meaning, They vary in how they engage, and they vary in how they interact with ideas, materials, and other people while they're learning. And we know something from MRI scans of the brain while the brain learns that we didn't know 30 years ago. So we have, I think, a responsibility as educators to use science, right? I wouldn't want my surgeon to say like, there's a new way to get the gallbladder out, but I'm not going to read that today, right? I want people to use the best practices that emerge from the most current research. So what we know from the fields of neuroscience and the learning sciences is that the human brain while learning is variable. And it's not a new way of saying disability. All brains vary in how they learn. Human variability exists within individuals and among individuals. I am different from you, and I am different from me, depending on the context. Learners who happen to have a label of Down syndrome do not all have the same kinds of brains, right? Learners who have a label of dyslexia do not all have the same kinds of brains. There may be some commonalities in how some people learn some days, but what we understand from the learning sciences is that variability is part of everybody, right? We all vary, and that we really can be designing with that in mind. Variability is also contextual. Let me just say, so we know that there are networks of the brain, and that that is where that's the starting point for the framework of the UDL guidelines. So I didn't say that very well. Let me say that again. So we have these networks of the brain, and this is what we've come to understand, right? And that help us to learn. We have the affective network, which kind of says, like, why are we doing this anyway, right? It's kind of the why of learning. It's the emotional piece of learning. No, we can't check our emotions at the door, right? We know that there's a direct relationship between emotion and cognition. We have the strategic network, which is kind of like the how of learning. How am I going to navigate this? What am I going to do? What am I going to say? What am I going to demonstrate? How am I going to show my thinking? And then we have the recognition network. What is this? What is this article that I'm reading? What is this image that I'm seeing? And it's the meaning-making network. And what we've learned is that people vary in how in those networks, and that's what universal design for learning is really based on. We also know that variability is contextual. So this is an image of me in a meeting, and I'm going to use myself as an example here. So in a meeting, if somebody's talking and talking and talking, I find it fascinating. I love lectures. I listen to podcasts. I feel like if I listen to a podcast about something I don't know about, I could give a workshop on it, an hour later, right? And I'm kidding. But I think to myself sometimes, I know everybody else wants this lecture to end, and I just love listening. I feel like I can really learn that way. Well, that wasn't true when my boyfriend was trying to teach me how to fly fish, right? He was talking and talking and talking and talking, and he could have gone on for another 3 hours, and I still couldn't figure out how to get my arm up and cast it right, and my line kept getting tangled in the tree. So am I an auditory learner? I'm not really an auditory learner, because when Joe was talking, I didn't understand. It took the cook coming out of a fishing camp, the cook in the kitchen, seeing me, saying like, honey, look at this. I've been watching you all day. And she grabbed my arm and she pulled it back, and she showed me what it felt like to cast when you're fly fishing. Or I don't even know if you call it cast, but to do it. I never got that good. Now, am I a kinesthetic learner, right? Because I remember being a special education teacher and having to give my kids a little inventory. Are you a visual, auditory, or kinesthetic learner? Kind of what we used to know, but what we now know is no longer really a valid research-based construct. So if you were trying to teach me how to quilt, and I live in New Hampshire where people seem to quilt and knit and everybody sews everything, and I don't sew anything. I take things to the tailor to get a button put on. You could talk to me about sewing. You could give me podcasts about sewing. You could do hand-over-hand instruction about sewing, and I'm just not interested in sewing, right? I just don't really see the relevance, and it's not, and I have some negative experiences in the past. My point here is that I'm not one kind of learner, that the context for learning really changes. And every single one of those stories that I just told would be completely different if I said I was listening to a podcast and my father was in the hospital and I was worried about him. Or I was fly fishing and my father was in the hospital and I was worried about him. Or I was learning to sew and I was coming down with a flu, right? So the contextual nature of learning changes all the time, and only the learner really knows how he or she is going to most effectively make meaning, be able to demonstrate understanding, and to engage. So the third core concept of UDL is that variability is predictable in learning and can be designed for. So we say all learners vary in how they engage, all learners vary in how they make meaning, all learners vary in how they interact with ideas, materials, and each other. But there is a range, right? And it's predictable. And people vary kind of from here to here. And there's a range from here to here. And I'm using my hands kind of like very generally here because it's not a black and white range. But what we've learned from the learning sciences is that we can predict to some degree the range of human variability in those three networks, right? In that strategic network, in that recognition network, and in that engagement network. And that because we can predict that variability to some degree, we can predict kind of where people will land, we can design learning proactively. We can think in our learning designs about engagement and ask ourselves, how are learners going to engage? And make sure we don't just design one way. We can think about representation and of the content in our learning designs, and we can ask ourselves, how will learners perceive and comprehend this content and not just design one way? And then we can think also about how learners will act upon their learning, how they'll show us their thinking, how they'll demonstrate what they know and understand, and then make sure that we don't just design one way, that we give learners options. This is where the UDL guidelines come into play, right? As we ask these questions, we say, how will learners engage? And more specifically, how will we recruit their interest? How will we help them sustain effort and persistence? How will we help them to self-regulate? And again, I'm not going to do a whole UDL training here, but I want to give you a sense of the connection between the framework and the thinking that we're doing today about learners with disabilities. So just take a moment and as you heard me talking, maybe there was something that you were interested in, maybe something I said about neuroscience, made you want to go find that research, maybe something about variability. How might you or someone else learn more about UDL? Feel free to link any resources that you know about that you think others might really enjoy. Put them in the chat box, or again, just think quietly and make a note to yourself. And now I'm going to go through a history of our questions. And there are questions about learners with disabilities and learning designs. And I think that you'll recognize many of you who are just starting out in your careers might hear some history that you don't know as much about as those of us who have been doing this for decades. And those of you who are have been in this field a long time may recognize some of the ways that we used to kind of think about special education. So I'm going to tell you some stories. The first is from my very first teaching experience. I was a student teacher at the International School of Brussels in Belgium, and I was working in a third grade class. And in 1986, at the high school, kids with disabilities were in a self-contained, segregated special education classroom at that school, but they were mainstreamed for part of the day. And Tina was mainstreamed for part of the day into an art class. Tina had a label of cerebral palsy, and the principal came and asked me, would you fill in to be her paraprofessional, her teaching assistant for her art class? Because the paraprofessional is out today. She's out sick. And I was a student teacher, so of course I said yes, because you have to say yes to everything when you're a student teacher, right? And I went and I met Tina. And I had been told she had cerebral palsy, and it seemed like she did. She walked around the classroom and she moved in kind of big motion ways. She didn't talk with me. And In fact, she didn't really interact with me at all. And I noticed that the class was doing this activity where they had to take a page of a magazine, tear it in half, and then use colored pencils to recreate the other side. So I was wearing my special education hat, of course, and I was thinking about what Tina could do and what Tina couldn't do. And I thought, she can't work on an 8.5 by 11 paper, and she can't use skinny colored pencils. So I got her a piece of chart paper, that really big kind that you see in elementary classrooms. And I got her some of those crayons, those thick ones that you can't break even if you try. And I said, why don't you color? And I did one thing right that day, and that is that I kind of aided and faded, and I walked away. And when I came back, she had made some marks on the page, and I had seen her from afar. She kind of took the red and went like that, took the blue and went like that. When I came back, I said something like, wow, I love all the colors on your page. Why don't you make a rainbow, right? As if I was like dropping this incredible high expectation, right? So this is an embarrassing story. You might just like, you know, stop listening to this video because I know this is a recorded session. You may just say, forget it. I'm not going to listen to this woman. She doesn't know what she's doing. But wait before you leave. Listen to the end of the story. And so she made a rainbow, right? She made the red, and she at the bottom of the page. And I walked away again, and I came back. And when I came back, this is what I saw. I'll go back. I did not think, it says I am bored. I did not think that she had language. I did not think that she had literacy. I did not think that she had writing skills, spelling skills, capitalization skills, punctuation skills, underlining the most important word in a sentence skills. I am embarrassed to tell you that because Tina had cerebral palsy and she didn't speak, I did not think she had language. I did not expect her to be able to communicate with me with words. So the first thing I did, which I think we should do more often in schools, is I apologized. And I said, I'm really sorry. And the second thing I did was I asked her if I could have it, if I could have her paper. And I promised her that I would tell her story to every teacher that I ever met so that people would understand the importance of presuming competence. And I've kept that promise, and I'm keeping it today. Because I think that Tina sits on my shoulder now as I do everything, and she reminds me that we just don't know. And as Ann Donlin and Martha Leary say, when in the absence of valid and reliable data, we must make the assumption that, if proven wrong, will do the least amount of harm. We must presume competence. We can't wait for learners to prove to us that they are worth educating, right? We need to educate every single learner. We need to give them access to learning, and not wait for that proof. I want to go back a couple slides so you can close your eyes if you're going to get dizzy. And just say that at this time, when I was there with Tina, the question that I was asking about learning design and learners with disabilities was, should I just change the goal? And I modified the goals. Sometimes, you know, we even would write new goals, and sometimes we would actually engage students in inclusive education for certain periods without any goals at all. So you'll see these questions kind of dropped through the stories that I tell you, and you'll notice that the first part of each question has the word change, right? And you'll see that in this case, I think we were sometimes wondering if we needed to change the goal. I left my student teaching, and I took my first teaching position in New Hampshire. All of these other stories happened in New Hampshire. And I got a job in this little adorable antique red schoolhouse on the right-hand side that was next to the main building, which is the elementary school on the left-hand side, which was fine and adorable, and all my college friends thought it was quaint, except that it was a self-contained special education primary grades classroom. And when I was putting a multiplication facts train on the wall, I remember this so well, 23 years old, you know, stapling up the multiplication facts train cars on the wall with construction paper. The principal walked in and he said, "You must be our new teacher." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Welcome to our school. I just want to let you know that you probably don't want to bring your learners to the cafeteria." And I said, "Well, why is that?" And he said, because I had a teeny little classroom in this little building, and he said, because they don't have proper eating skills. And I think I learned that year many things, lots of things, but I learned that you really can't learn proper eating skills if people around you don't have them. if you do have proper eating skills in a school cafeteria, it's a social liability, right? No one's going to sit with you if you put your napkin in your lap. And as a teacher, I really couldn't model that. I was pretty busy, right? I couldn't just keep eating and modeling those proper eating skills. This was a job where I really worked hard to mainstream my students into the typical first grade classroom. My special education director didn't love that idea, and she would give me things like this. And this was a textbook that she let me borrow. It's called Teaching the Moderately and Severely Handicapped. And if you notice the table of contents, there's nothing academic there. Self-care skills, gross motor skills, fine motor and pre-vocational skills, household management skills, all things that we use and we do, but nothing about literacy, nothing about history or poetry or science. So I knew that that wasn't what I wanted to do with my class, and I tried really hard to get my class sort of access and invitation to the first grade general education classroom. One day after school, I went over and I asked the teacher, the first grade teacher, I said, okay, I want you to tell me every single thing my learners need to know, understand, and be able to do to be members of this classroom. And I wanted to gain them access to that classroom. I wanted to gain them membership in that classroom. And I remember very well, she wrote down, in very perfect cursive first grade teacher writing on the dotted line paper, she wrote down all the stuff my class would need to be able to do. And that became my curriculum. That became what I wanted learners to do. And though I had high expectations and though I wanted my learners to be connected to real academic goals in the general education curriculum, and I'm glad about that, I do feel some remorse and embarrassment that what I was trying to do was change the learner. Right? I had this belief that learners, that they were not welcome as they were, and I was being told that, in fact, right? If you work in special ed, you know the look that you get sometimes when your students are in that general education classroom, or a student, and it's like time to go, and the teacher kind of looks at you from the doorway like, yeah, I think we should go now. It was almost like the formula was, if these students have more knowledge and more skill, then they can have more access to general education. But of course we know that students shouldn't have to change in order to be educated. If you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you might be familiar with this if you've heard Norman Kuhn speak, and I know I saw him on the conference agenda, and so hi, Norman. Norman talked about this years ago, about how in some ways we kind of mix up Maslow, right? We say that instead of supporting learners to belong and then watching them gain self-esteem, we almost say like, hey, get some self-esteem, do some achievement, get some mastery, respect, and recognition, and then you can belong. But what we know is that belonging is a prerequisite to learning, right? If you believe what Maslow has laid out, belonging comes first. And that in order to achieve and gain self-esteem, right, belonging is a first step. And I don't know where this quote came from, but I think it comes from all of us who have been working really hard in this field of inclusive education for a long time. I got really tired that year, not tired from being a first-year teacher, but tired from like working the crowd, working so hard to advocate, to get my kids to get into the pumpkin carving party, and to get my class into the time when the science department, science center came to bring a fox and to show the learners, and always worried that we were going to get the look and be told to leave. So I became a first and second grade classroom teacher in a small school in New Hampshire. And there was a student who had spent all 6 of her years so far in a self-contained special education school, and her mom wanted her to be included. So she was in my class. We did not include her fully in academics. She had a special education teacher who did her work with her, right? We're going to do our work, and she's going to do her work. And the questions that we were asking at the time, and were really tied to ability and our perception of what was relevant for learners. So I won't read you all of these. This came from an organization that I worked for a long time called the Institute on Disability, which is a University Center of Excellence on Disability housed at the University of New Hampshire. And this was like back in the late 80s. And we would ask teachers to think about inclusive education this way. We would say like, can, and I'm really paraphrasing because in this presentation right now, I can't even read with my 55-year-old eyes this text on the screen. Can the learner be doing what everybody else is doing? And if yes, then do that. And if not, can we change something in a little way so the learner can be doing what everybody else is doing? And if yes, then great, do that. And if not, can the learner be doing her work or his work instead of what everybody else is doing? And if yes, do that. Well, can the learner, if that's not going to work, can the learner like go to the different part of the room and do something different? Can the learner like go out in the hall? Can the learner like go to a different classroom? You get the idea. So it was always about the learner and the match of the learner to the learning environment. And we gave people, I think, even though this was a starting point around inclusion, it was also a permission slip around exclusion, right? And it said you can put kids out in the hall because we never really thought about changing the learning design. We just thought about changing the learner. We made predictions about what was relevant, and we mainstreamed students based on our perceptions of their abilities. I think it's probably, in my career in special education, the most dangerous question that we've ever asked is, can she get something out of it? Well, should she be included in the first grade literacy lesson? They're going to be reading Charlotte's Web. No, I don't think she's going to get anything out of it. I think that was a mistake we made time and time again, thinking that we would know the answer to that question. And I don't think we did. I left that position for personal reasons, nothing to do with my career, and landed in a different community and was looking for a job one summer. And I walked into this school and said to the principal, "Are you hiring any teachers?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Great." And he said, "We're only hiring special educators." And I said, "I don't want to be a special educator. I don't even think I believe in that anymore." And he said, "Wait, don't go." He said, "We've gotten rid of all of our special education classrooms." And I want to just highlight, this is 1989 that this happened. We've gotten rid of all of our special education classrooms. We made a room with like little, looks like an insurance company, you know, with little cubbies for special education teachers and related service providers to be have a desk, basically. And we have assigned you'll have a caseload of learners, but in theory, you're kind of going to have a caseload of teachers. And you'll be working, if you take this job, with all the K-3 teachers. And your job would be to support them to be the best teacher for all kids they could be. Maybe you co-teach, maybe you make curricular modifications, maybe you design supports and accommodations in the learning environment. But your job is going to be an inclusion facilitator. All kids are fully included in general education classes. And this was a community that was known as having like the lowest budget for school in our state, and still today probably qualifies for that designation. And I say that because I think sometimes people think that inclusive education costs all this money, and it can. Education costs a lot of money, but inclusion is a philosophy, and then that philosophy is free, and that commitment is not something we have to put in the budget. That commitment is something we've got to put in our hearts and minds. Part of my job that year was to bring kids back from out-of-district placements into the school, and one of those students was named Matt. I went with a second grade teacher to meet Matt at his special school, and when I got there, there were lots of, maybe like, I don't know, 7 adults and 7 kids. And most of the kids used wheelchairs, and they had like things on their wheelchair trays, like pillows, plastic pillows full of water with little foam fish. And the activity was like, get your arm up and, push the little fish. Lots of feeding and cleaning, and nobody was reading a book, right? And I looked over, and I was supposed to be watching Matt, but I was watching this other kid, and he was sitting at a table, and he was drawing. And if you're in education, sometimes some kids just catch your eye for no reason. And so I got really distracted by him, and he was drawing this duck. And I walked over and I said to him, like, "Hey, that's a really great duck." And he didn't stop. He didn't draw more. He didn't respond to me in any way. He just kept drawing as if I wasn't even there. So I thought to myself, right, special education hat, I thought, he probably has autism spectrum disorder. Then I went back and I saw he put little lines behind the duck. And so I said something like, thinking this was his communication, like, "Oh, I love the way you put those lines in there. I really get it. The duck is going through the water." And he doesn't look up, he doesn't do anything. Then like 5 minutes later, I go pay attention to Matt. And 5 minutes later, he stands up, he holds up his pencil, and he's like, hey, Mom, when are you going to be done with work? And where should I put this pencil? Now, this is a kid whose bus got dropped him off too early for his mom's work schedule. And so they had arranged to have his bus drop him off at his mom's job, right? His mom worked at that special school, and he was a typical fourth grader who just was hanging out there. And his mom was probably busy like me and said, like, go over there and draw. Why did I think he had autism spectrum disorder, right? Because I had this 4 years of training in special education. I don't know, maybe, but probably because of the environment, right? Probably because that environment was kind of a place where the whole thing was designed around what people couldn't and shouldn't and wouldn't and didn't do. So I was thinking like, what's his label, right? That was the question that I was asking myself. As embarrassing as these stories are to tell, I tell them because I think that it's our humility and our really that is, well, it's our mistakes that help us learn. So that's kind of a horrible story about the power of the environment, that I can think that a learner who doesn't have a label actually has autism spectrum disorder just because of the setting, right? But that same power of the environment is true when you flip the story. And so when Matt came back to the second grade classroom, and for those of you who like the history of inclusive education, I'll just tell you that the year was 1989, and the school board had approved that Matt could come back for 15 minutes a week. This is, you heard it right, 15 minutes a week that the school board had decided. So when Matt came back for his 15 minutes a week, it happened to be music time. And Matt was in the class, and the music teacher, it was the school that had art on a cart, music on a cart. So the music teacher comes in with her cart, and I watch her, and I watch her notice that there's a new student in the class, and she kind of does the counting thing. And she was not a teacher that had gone to like an inclusive academy over the summer or anything like that. And then she walked back, and she came in with another recorder. She didn't see Matt as a kid with a label. She saw Matt as a musician. Right? She saw Matt as a kid that needed to play the recorder. So the power of the environment is really strong, no matter what that environment is. We were in that time period, I think, thinking a lot about changing the setting, right? We thought that we would try it out. And in large part, it was a great question to be asking. Like, let's think about context here. Let's think about the learning environment. I guess one thing I reflect back and wonder is to what degree we were treating inclusive education as an experiment, and almost like kids had to almost apply, right? It didn't really work out for Ricardo. It didn't really work out for Lucille. It wasn't a right. It was more of an experiment in some parts, but we started to ask the question about setting. I spent a lot of years after that providing technical assistance and training to schools that were trying to support kids with developmental disabilities to be included fully in general education classes. I worked on a lot of systems change projects through the University of New Hampshire. And I did some writing with the Institute on Disability. And again, these are embarrassing documents to pull up, but I think it's an important part of our history. This was that, remember that hierarchy of curriculum modification questions, like can the learner do what everybody else is doing? And if not, like can the learner be like out, 5 states away doing something different? This was a little bit better, right? This was the next iteration on that thinking. And it took those hierarchy questions from like 10 questions down to 2. And the first question is, can the learner do what everybody else is doing? And if so, great, do it. And the second question is, what will it take? What will it take for the learner to be able to engage in this lesson? What will it take for the learner to be able to make meaning? What will it take for the learner to be able to interact with ideas, materials, and other students during this learning, right? Will it take modified materials? Will it take additional supports? Will it take changed expectations? And sometimes we change goals still, right? So we weren't all the way there, but we were moving, I think, in the right direction. You'll notice also, if you look at this slide and you zoom in, that there are some questions at the bottom that begin to start to kind of import some values. Like, do learners have a way to communicate all day long, not just during speech therapy? Do learners have the opportunity to give as well as receive support? Not just like, who is Jenny? Oh, I know her in my class. I work with her, right? Do learners have opportunities to learn core academic skills? Are learners supported to make friends? This is just a quick little story about one of the consultation jobs that I did, and it wasn't the most important one or the most interesting one, but I think it paints the picture of what individualized supports and accommodations looked like back in this time in our journey of inclusive education. So this is Alex, and I was called in to consult on Alex, his class, because the teachers didn't think he had empathy skills, right? They said, Alex just acts out and then people get hurt and he doesn't seem to really understand what's happening. So I went into the class and I watched and I sat in the back and I looked and I took notes. And the teacher was sitting in a rocking chair. The learners were on the floor. The teacher was reading a story about apples, and she had given the children the instruction that if they had an apple connection, they could make it. They could tell her, I have an apple connection, and raise their hand. So she starts reading the story about apples, and somebody raises their hand and says, I made an apple pie with my grandmother. And she said, thank you for that connection. And Alex had his hand up the whole time. Alex, this is not actually Alex, this is a stock photo, but this little guy with the blonde hair. And eventually she called on him, and he said, he made an apple connection, and she said, thank you. And then he kept his hand up, and he kept his hand up, and she didn't call on him, and she saw his hand stay up, and she said something like, we're going to call on our other friends. I see your hand, Alex. And then Alex started to get a little closer to the child in front of him, and then he started to get a little closer to bopping the hair of the ponytail of the girl nearby, and a sneaker got a little closer to moving a little bit, and all of a sudden he kicked the child in front of him, grabbed onto the ponytail, right, and then chaos kind of erupted. Alex had somebody sit him down and say, this is what's going to happen now. Alex had all sorts of stimulus going on, lots of different kinds of teachers at different levels. It was a laboratory school, so there were all sorts of hierarchies of people with different responsibilities and roles. What we came to understand about Alex is that Alex was not a kid that needed to learn empathy skills. Alex was a kid that needed to have a more active role in learning in order to stay engaged. It was not enough. A design that said you can sit here on this rug and sit still, listen to this story, which was arguably not the most interesting story in the world, make one apple connection, and then wait for this to be over, was not enough. Alex could not stay engaged. He could not sustain effort and persistence in that situation. He needed a more active role. Turns out the teacher, we brainstormed, and she thought, well, we've been working on tally marks and in our math curriculum. We could have like a tally chart of all the different kinds of apples, and Alex could sit up here. He could have a more active role. Every time somebody says, I did an apple pie with my grandmother, he could say, what kind of apple did you use, and make a tally mark for Empire apples or a tally mark for Golden Delicious apples. Alex could play a more active role, and not just in the apple story, right, but across the curriculum. That became an individualized accommodation for Alex. In every lesson that they designed, they began to think about what role can Alex play that will give him a way to engage that's a little more stimulating. He was a kid that made really quick cognitive connections. He didn't have a behavior disorder, right? Alex was a kid who made quick cognitive connections, and he wanted to keep making them. Those were the days, I think, of individualized supports and accommodations. And if you're hearing that story thinking that's what we do right now, that's not bad, right? That's still a dignified and respectful way of supporting someone to engage in a learning environment, is to say, here, we've designed this support, or we've made this accommodation so that this fits better for you. We thought at that time, and we still think today, about changing, hopefully not changing goals, but changing expectations. Alex is not expected anymore to just sit still and be able to regulate in that way. Changing the materials, maybe changing the kinds of supports, and we make these accommodations for learners who have disabilities. They're not accommodations that we build into the whole lesson, right? Everybody can have choice around their role, or everybody can have accessible digital fonts. They're accommodations we make just for kids who we deem need them, for whom they're necessary. My final, I'm skipping a few career steps in there, but I came a couple years ago to CAST because I feel like the question that Universal Design for Learning asks is the best question that we've been asking and the boldest question that we can ask about learning design and learners with disabilities. CAST is the organization. It's a nonprofit organization based out of the Wakefield, Massachusetts, north of Boston. And they are the originators of the UDL guidelines. And you can read some interesting stories about kind of how that the guidelines came to be. The UDL guidelines say, when you're designing learning, you might want to pay attention to this stuff because we know from neuroscience that people vary in how they learn. And we know that that variability happens around engagement, happens around meaning making, like how content is represented, the word representation is there, and action and expression, how learners do stuff during that learning experience. We know that learners differ in that way, and it's predictable, right? So you could just pay attention to these things in design, and you will have a much higher likelihood of designing learning that works for more people, right? That works for more learners. The question is not really a question, right? It's more of an excited statement, right? We're not saying, should we change the learning design? We're like, change the learning design. When I had Kara in my first and second grade class and I was teaching the reading lesson, I never really thought, and I don't know why, but I never really thought, well, this lesson doesn't work for Kara, so I'll change this lesson. And I probably am changing it in a way that it will help other people too. I just said, okay, Mrs. Sterling, her special education teacher, you can take Kara out of the room during this time. I thought about changing the learner. I thought about changing the schedule. I thought about changing the setting, but I never really thought about changing the learning design. And I think that my story parallels the story of many of us in the field of special education. UDL says, change the learning design. Design for learner variability. Use that neuroscience to inform your design. Anticipate the barriers in design, where kids are going to bump up against barriers during learning. Provide options for learners, and don't assign learners to those options. Like I've assigned you to table A because that's at your level, and assigned you to table B because that's at your level. Instead, give learners the agency to make decisions about which resource might work for me, how I want to make a choice around using a fidget or not using a fidget during this lesson. Reflecting on that choice, becoming better at learning. Remember Harriet, right? Becoming really good as a learner at the art of learning, building what we call expert learning. So thinking about UDL and returning to Alex for just a moment, what we would say is Alex needed a design that gave him more options for sustaining effort and persistence, right? Just to say, Alex, sit down and just stay tough, right? This lesson's going to be over at some point, right? It wasn't enough. He needed different options. He needed choice around how he would sustain effort and persistence during that lesson. And he needed some options perhaps for self-regulation, right? He could not hold it together. He didn't say, I'm going to hit this little girl. He needed more stimulation. He needed that to self-regulate. So how do we build that in rather than ask Alex to kind of take care of it himself, right? He can't stand up and say, hey, listen, I'm 5. This design isn't really working for me. I really need some options for self-regulation. So if you could pause that Apple story for a second. So how do we proactively anticipate, right, what learners might need, anticipate those barriers, and design flexibility into the design? How do we change the learning design so that learners can come and feel like they knew I was coming? Like they designed this for me, right? They expected me to be here. Just a reminder that these UDL guidelines align closely with those expert learner characteristics. And to close our session today, I want to let you hear from another expert learner. So I told you Harriet's story, and I want to end with an expert learner story as well. And this is an 8-minute video of Grant Blasco, who is a high school student. And it's a piece of a presentation that he did for the AuCom conference in 2019. You'll also see linked on the slide, grantblasco.com, his website, and I encourage you to check it out. Grant is quite an expert learner and a reflective thinker. So I'm going to play the video.
So as I explained, I've had the opportunity to speak at conferences many times about my school-based inclusion experience, my thoughts on communication rights, and my work toward typing independence. I am grateful every time people entrust me with responsibility to deliver a message to an audience. So, when I was asked to suggest a keynote topic, I thought my hopes for this are little beyond what I have talked about before. But before I dive into that, let me share a little about my experience. As I said, I am 17 now. I started typing at 9 after a long history of lots of typical autism interventions, which was technically the end of 3rd grade for me. I went to my public school in 4th grade only to be put in a segregated autism classroom, and then, with a lot of advocacy from my parents and a few professionals, I have been included in general education classes since 5th grade. Since then, I have been included in general education classes with a one-on-one educator to support my communication needs for 5th through my present 11th grade. I know that this fact alone makes me one very lucky kid. So, over the years I have shared how we went through the process of getting support in my schools. My journey included a major move across the country in 2017, so I should also explain that we've had to win over staff at one public elementary school and middle school in Maryland, and then completely venture into unknown territory by traveling to a school in Bellevue, Washington for the last half of 8th grade. Nobody in the Seattle area had seen a kid like me in a school, autistic, non-speaking, AAC user, grade-level general education classes. They heard I had been included in Maryland with a 1-1 power and accommodations, and they were pretty much on board from the beginning to include me there too. I think it helped that I was able to type without direct support by then, but still, no pushback? This was great luck for me. I think the timing was fortunate, because my new district in Washington State was already taking steps to become a SWIFT school, so when I walked through the doors, I think they saw it as an opportunity to support a more complicated student in inclusion. In a nutshell, this is what I want to share. You see, I had mindshare and support from the very beginning, and I have highly motivated professionals all around me who want to see me included, but the process of doing it has still been bumpy and lonely. It's still a learning process that I never realized could be this hard. That's what I want to share. That inclusion is about so much more than just a desire to include students. I'm fortunate to travel to conferences and spend time with professionals, so I am aware of what typical supports and strategies are used to include kids like me. What I did not realize was how much work needs to happen all over a system in order for a kid like me to walk into a classroom and feel successful every day. We have all heard what accommodations to ask for. The typical accommodations are listed on an IEP, and being eligible for them means that a school needs to provide them. My typical accommodations are things like access to digital print materials, a human reader, a scribe, extra time to complete assignments, and sensory breaks. However, having accommodations means that you are one student among many students with different requirements. I spend a lot of time thinking about how things can be better for students like me, but I also notice kids all around me who could use some of the accommodations I get. Years ago, I started learning about universal design for learning, and I am convinced that if schools were more focused on UDL, more kids like me could be included. I am going to let Michael explain all the technical details, but I'll share this. Really, almost every accommodation I need can be found in classrooms with great accessibility. So much of my daily stress comes from trying to jump through hoops every day to gain access. Even if there is a person assigned to help me, no one person can do it all. As schools have given us more access to technology, more sources of information for learning are present. My experience is that so many students who type are trying to gain access to classes by getting their communication recognized as valid. Once you gain access though, there is much that can be done to make the next part of the journey less stressful. Give the kids a break. So what do I mean by that? Prepare for a student to be in your class. Accommodations are necessary sometimes, but I think we should be planning for more variability of students in classrooms from the beginning. I am welcomed into classes, but that does not mean they were designed for me, or that a teacher is ready for me. Here's what might happen. A lesson might have objectives, activities, and assignments that never consider how I will do any of that work. The materials may not be digital, so that means I might not be able to increase the size, or use my text-to-speech accommodation. The worksheets may be on paper, or a scanned picture of a document, which means that someone will need to create the document especially for me. The activity may call for a small group discussion over just a couple of minutes. I am supposed to get questions ahead, but that doesn't happen every day. So I do the best I can. But it is stressful. In universal design, so many of these stressors would be removed. That's what I want to make sure I talk about. Powers who support students who type can move mountains, but the work should be distributed. When teachers don't really know all the ways I am running into barriers, then they can't improve at including more kids like me. My heart breaks when I walk into a class and realize nobody thought about how I would participate ahead of time, and when I am sad, I have a much harder time staying calm and attentive. The para with me will now have to scramble, and everyone sees all the effort, so I won't look competent to many people today. Yesterday's presentation by Dr. Laurent and Dr. Fee resonated so much with me. I have been studying about the effects of stress on brains for the last couple years, and I need to say that my whole day is often managing my reactions to things like accessibility issues. I try to shake it off, but every occurrence of similar scenarios from other days flashes through my mind, and I struggle to keep my focus. Okay, then there's always the chance that a well-meaning teacher realizes I am not dysregulated, and thinks I totally don't need to do this activity after all, and excuses me from work. In some cases, this is fine because I can show my value in other ways, but teachers should know that this does not feel inclusive to me, and it's embarrassing and demotivating, and it makes me wonder why I ever got out of bed that morning. So, let me start to share my vision. Let's get better at UDL. Today we will go over a lot to think about, and I hope it leads to a great discussion.
So I just want to close by reminding us that the goal of UDL is expert learning. And if you think about what you heard Grant say and like align it to some of these characteristics that you see on the screen, it's really clear that Grant is an expert learner. One of my fears sometimes is that schools implement universal design for learning, and they say that we're including all students with disabilities, but not all students with disabilities are necessarily given access to general education in classrooms. That sometimes we implement UDL and we still run life skill programs, and we have the plan that someday, right, we're moving in the right direction and someday we'll rethink this. I think it's pretty critical that all learners become expert learners, not because that's a lovely thing, but because that may be tied to survival in an economy and in a world that requires learning, that learning is a survival skill. So to deny anybody access to an opportunity to become an expert learner feels like we're moving in the wrong direction. And how is it that learners become expert learners? By making decisions, right? By making choices about how they're going to engage, by making choices about how they want to make meaning, which representation of the content works for me, by writing their own learning plans, by making decisions about how they want to demonstrate and show what they know and understand. So I'll just invite you to close, to think a little bit about anything that maybe you want to add to your to-do list. Has this session nudged you in any way to say, you know, I want to talk to or reach out to, or I want to read or learn more about? Maybe just take a moment quietly to reflect on that. I know sometimes I have lots of ideas popping when I go to conferences. Or perhaps you'll add it to the chat and we can learn from each other about some of the ways that we might be able to move this work forward. Thank you for listening. It's always sort of awkward to do a pre-recorded session, so I invite you to have dialogue with me if you want to reach out. That's my email. You can also follow me on Twitter. And I've included in this slide deck some additional resources, which I won't go through now, but you'll see there's some additional resources that you might find interesting. Also, feel free to visit the CAST webpage. There's always some good stuff happening there. So thank you. Have a wonderful conference, and thank you for inviting me.